So a couple of places where servicing might be applicable in low Earth orbit, as opposed to GEO, where most of your listeners obviously know that's 35,000 kilometers up. But if you've got 30,000 satellites in orbit, do you really want to replace that many every few years, or does it make sense to add things to them, to upgrade them on orbit? How does that trade work out?
Right.
And if some of them die, right, the historical failure rate for satellites like that is about 5%. What happens to those? Do they start banging into your good satellites, right? Can you keep track of them, or do you want something to go up there and dispose of them? So servicing can actually help do that as well.
Right. I really like the idea of picking up the garbage too, because we're going to be throwing all these satellites, these little CubeSats, small sats up there in numbers that we've never done before. The tracking is not really figured out. And there is this assumption that has been made by a lot of people that, oh, they'll just burn up on reentry into the atmosphere when they die. That is not necessarily true. We don't really know what's going to happen there. So a kind of a space garbage truck to go in the low Earth orbit and pick these guys up is probably a good idea.
People are still working on the economics of that, right? So if I have to send up a robotic satellite, attach it to another satellite, and deorbit that entire stack, that's a very expensive proposition when you're talking about doing that by the thousands, right? So can I build something that is very efficient with its propellant or something so that it can grab one satellite, give it a push down in the atmosphere, go up and grab the next one, give it a push? And reusability is going to be a theme that I'm going to come back to a lot.
Right. I had a fellow on who was talking about a space forge, and so grabbing old satellites and kicking them up to another orbit, maybe, and recycling them and turning them into something else would be interesting. So,
well, and it would be just about as good for the debris problem, right? You could start agglomerating these dead satellites in one place, so that means it's easier to track, easier to avoid, and then whatever you're going to do with them, let's say aluminum. Right, aluminum would be a really good substance to get back out of those. You could do that later, but just the act of sticking them all together, let's say at 2,000 kilometers, where we don't tend to orbit a lot of things, you really have done a good service there.
Right. Yeah, I really like that idea. Who knows when it's going to become economically effective? As long as we're not launching something from the ground to go up there and grab these things every single time. If we can get something up there that can kind of hop up and down a little bit, grab, move, and go back. And I think that would be the biggest cost to avoid. So obviously DARPA is looking into this. Who else is developing this capability?
So Northrop Grumman developed their mission extension vehicle on their own nickel. Right. So there's one that's in orbit now. The second one's going to be launched middle of the year or something like that. So that was private investment. There are a lot of small companies that are starting to look at space tugs and space servicing now. Some of them are proposing to do relatively simple things like inspection from a few kilometers away. And you might say, well, what's the market for that? The insurance companies are really interested in that, because it's kind of like having an insurance adjuster that can go look at something and say, what's really wrong with that bird? I mean, when Intelsat 29E failed this last summer, it looked like it blew up. I am certain that the satellite manufacturer would love to have some imagery of that to say, oh, I see what went wrong there, and I don't think that exists yet. But that's another private investment kind of thing. NASA is so interested in this whole area that they're creating an organization. It's called the National On-Orbit Servicing, Assembly, and Manufacture Initiative, because they believe that the defense side, the intelligence side, the commercial side, and NASA have common interests in this whole area. And so they're trying to create an organization that all four of those sectors contribute to. They haven't gotten to the point yet where they're actually starting to fund R&D, but I think that's going to come pretty soon.
Right. Well, I can see this conversation starting to happen where we've got people in the room who were in their silos up until recently.
Yep.
In the orbital detection, collision prevention, the math guys, and the satellite manufacturers, the government agencies, and some other actors are finally starting to really talk about this. More engineers are not going to solve your problem. It's not a technical problem in that sense. It's a process problem. And the time to fix your processes was 20 months ago, and the second best time is today. This is Jason Kanigan, the president of Cold Star Technologies and the host of this podcast, the Cold Star Project, which is all about identifying and solving process problems for space companies, because that's what we do. And you can hear the entirety of this episode by following the link in the comment below.